All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here today. This is the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service monthly webinar. Today, we are talking about some legislation this year, some that passed, some that did not. I typically do an expungement updates webinar, but I've expanded the topic this year more broadly to include legislation centered on a topic we call decriminalization of poverty. My name is Chris Sweeney. I am a staff attorney here at MVLS. I manage our workforce development project, and I handle a lot of expungement work. My guest today, my co-presenter, is Christopher Dews from the Job Opportunities Task Force. How are you doing today?
I'm fantastic, Chris. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm Chris Dews, Senior Policy Advocate at the Job Opportunities Task Force. In one sentence, our mission is to help lower wage workers advance to higher wage jobs. And we mostly do that through public policy advocacy, workforce development, and research and public education. So yeah, that's us.
Glad to have you here today. So as I stated before, we're talking a little bit about some expungement legislation and some kind of broader concepts in Maryland's expungement law this afternoon. But we're also talking about decriminalization of poverty. And we are going to let Mr. Dews tell us what exactly that means.
Gotcha. So the decriminalization of poverty, we base our definition when we're working in this space based off of JOTF's 2018 report. And what this report was basically called was the criminalization of poverty, how to break the cycle through policy reform in Maryland. And it kind of defines criminalization of poverty in two very specific ways. And to make it very simple, it's in what ways does interactions, well, let me start with this. In what ways does being impoverished lead to individuals having interactions with the criminal justice system? And in what ways does having an interaction with the criminal justice system leave an individual impoverished? So basically, how do the poor end up incarcerated? And in what ways does being incarcerated leave individuals poor? So the areas that we looked at in this report, this is once again in 2018, was we looked at access to criminal record expungements, court mandated fines and fees, the pretrial home detention system, how child support is enforced while an individual is incarcerated, and also a host of motor vehicle laws that just for being lower income can lead to you being incarcerated. Now, there's many more avenues that are looked at, from racial profiling to lack of access to occupational licensing to education, but the report kind of centered on those 5 or 6 categories. And it's all based in an American Bar Association report that discovered that there are over 1,100 collateral consequences to having a criminal record just in the state of Maryland alone. And so yeah, more information and more details are going to be on that as we move further in this conversation.
Thanks, Chris. So as you were stating, this is a striking number of collateral consequences, and this is just the consequences of having a criminal record. And of course, in Maryland, even if someone is arrested, charged with a crime or a handful of crimes, and is not found guilty of any of those charges, they can often have a permanent criminal record unless they proactively file for expungement. Chris, do you have anything to add about some of these more specific consequences that are on this slide?
Yeah, actually. So, the big 4 that is commonly looked at is, obviously access to employment. About 94% of employers, this was just a study that was released in 2020 by HR.com, actually, that 94% of employers are going to perform at least one type of background check. And about 85% of employers, when surveyed, would request an international background check. So employers take the background check situation very, very seriously. I know Maryland has done a lot of different things like ban the box and stuff like that, but that's for initial job screenings. When it comes to once you acquire the position, the background check can easily have a person eliminated or removed from their place of employment. So that's one huge angle. Occupational licensing, just want to go through these really quickly, is when you're trying to get licensed for a position, depending on what your record is, you can be blocked from that altogether, even if the charge that you have doesn't necessarily have any relevance towards the licensing that you're going towards. Depending on what field you're going into, sometimes it makes sense, if you have fraud, then, trying to get a business loan would kind of makes a lot of sense, but sometimes, many times it does not. If you have public assistance or receiving some types of public assistance, having a criminal conviction can get that cut off, specifically SNAP and TANF. 4 out of every 5 landlords do a criminal background check before they even let you apply to live with them or any type of housing with them. And the vast majority of returning citizens experience homelessness within 30 days after their release from incarceration. And of course, if you are receiving a Pell Grant or any form of a scholarship or applying for scholarship, the one thing that they're going to look at is, do you have a criminal record? Do we want you on our campus? And that can be a massive barrier to access to education. And the key thing is whether you were found guilty or not. Just being charged many times is enough to put up that wall, because many people who are not in the legal profession do not know the difference between not guilty or an acquittal, dismissal, null pros, and an actual conviction. So I'll leave it there. But there's a lot of different statistics, and a lot of work has been done on the policy space to kind of like move us in the direction where after you've served your time, you can go back to your life. You don't have to sit there and serve this kind of street sentence, as we call it.
Right, and it's not too hard to see how this can create a cycle where if someone who's coming home from being incarcerated, or even from just having charges leveled against them and not found guilty, who may want to re-enter society, improve their life, gain access to employment and housing, can end up trapped and being blocked from returning to that way of life. So this slide is really just kind of, again, emphasizing the staggering statistics of how many people in our state do have a criminal record, and really just the overwhelming need for expungement. There has actually been automatic expungement enacted last year. We're going to talk about that in a couple of slides, but the need is still overwhelming. Most people who have a criminal record at this time are not going to have access to automatic expungement, and there's still a long ways to go.
I just wanted to highlight really quickly, 1.5 million Americans, 1.5 million Marylanders. That's an estimation from the National Employment Law Project. That's a lot of people. That's 1 out of every 4 working adults in the state. And I just want to be clear about 2 other things here. 15,000 Marylanders, roughly between 14 and 16. Some people would say 11,000 to 16,000 if you look at every single year from 2010 to now, are released from state prison, released specifically to Baltimore City. And as we go through other statistics throughout the rest of this presentation, you'll see why so much time, energy, and finances has been pushed into the city for that specific reason. If 1 out of every 3 returning citizens is there, then the work to make sure that those people have access to sustainable employment and aren't criminalized just because they're poor, or aren't levied with a bunch of fines and fees, becomes vital to ensuring that you have a safe and stable Baltimore, Maryland. I just wanted to slide that in there.
Yeah, thank you. So here is our expungement legislation that I wanted to discuss. So in the past 5 or 6 years, there have been some pretty major overhauls to the way that criminal record expungement works in Maryland. There was a time where having a conviction on your record would actually block even non-convictions from ever being expunged. 5, 6 years ago, when that changed, it opened up the floodgates, really, of the number of cases that could be expunged. And it sparked a conversation among legal advocates and non-legal community advocates and people affected by living with a criminal record about how harsh these consequences really are. And there has been a lot of legislation in the ensuing years to continue to expand access to criminal record expungement. The Redeem Act, which was in Annapolis this year, was mostly focused on the expungement of convictions. Now, a few years ago, legislation went into effect that for the first time allowed for the expungement of convictions. But it's already proving to, though it has been a substantial improvement, it has already in a short time proven to be relatively limited. You'll see on the left-hand column, this is the law that as it currently stands. For the vast majority of the misdemeanor convictions that are eligible, there's a 10-year waiting period, and that 10 years begins after the completion of any sentence, including parole, probation, supervision. And there is also a subsequent conviction rule in effect, meaning if someone 9 years into that waiting period got another conviction, no matter how minor, it could be something like trespassing or driving without a license, that would either restart that 10-year waiting period all over again, or if it were an ineligible conviction, meaning not eligible for expungement, it would permanently block the older misdemeanor case from coming off. That rule applies to the felony convictions as well. And you'll see that there's a 15-year waiting period on those. That would include things like felony theft, certain forms of burglary, drug possession with intent to distribute. It's not too hard to see how someone going through a period in their life where they have been arrested a handful of times over a short number of years, and then 10 to 15 years later has made drastic improvements in their life, may be stuck with a permanent criminal record. The other major issue with the law as it currently stands is the only types of convictions that are eligible for expungement come from this enumerated list in the statute. And especially when it comes to misdemeanor convictions, there are a number of relatively minor offenses that were simply omitted from the law, and those can never be expunged as it stands. I actually mentioned driving without a license a minute ago. That is one that cannot be expunged. Now, drug-related things, many of them can be expunged. First-degree burglary can be expunged. Second-degree assault can be expunged. But driving without a license cannot be expunged. And there are other sorts of contradictory outcomes in the statute as it currently stands. For example, I believe it's malicious burning of property in the second degree can be expunged, but malicious destruction of property cannot be expunged. So things that sound relatively similar in severity, but for whatever reason, one thing can be expunged and another can't. There's a whole host of things like this where outcomes that just simply don't make too much sense as to why something can be expunged while another thing can't. There's a very common charge that I see with my clients that is unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. This is something that blocks a lot of minor or even major things like felonies from coming off that would otherwise be eligible. It's a charge that I hear from my clients' experience is often levied against people who were pulled over and they were driving their friend's car because they didn't have a car and they were borrowing that vehicle. And of course, their name is out on the registration and they get slapped with this charge. So moving over to the proposed changes to improve the way expungement works. The waiting periods, according to many advocates, are unjustly long. If you can imagine having a theft conviction on your record from 10 or more years ago, because keep in mind that the 10 years begins after the completion of sentence. Someone who is trying to seek employment, seek housing, seeking to improve their lives, and being held back for something that happened more than 10 years ago, is holding back countless people and trapping people in a cycle of poverty. So reducing that waiting period to 3 years was on the table this year, reducing certain nonviolent felonies down from 15 years to 5 years was also on the table. And I think most importantly of all, expanding the eligibility, especially of misdemeanors, and removing this enumerated list and replacing it with eligibility for all misdemeanor convictions, with some very few exceptions for sexual crimes and anything found in the list of misdemeanors that might be particularly egregious. This would open up expungements drastically, and it would include things like kind of obscure violations of Department of Natural Resources codes, such as fishing violations or things like that. I think there was a lot of support from advocates this year. This bill, unfortunately, did not pass. It's something that I like to think is just getting off the ground. It's something that, like the long road to getting automatic expungement passed, is kind of a new frontier in expungement law that hopefully we will see more advocacy around as we live with the law as it currently is, and we see how it continues to negatively impact people's lives. There should be more advocacy around that law. Did you have anything to add on that, Chris?
Yeah, I just this is just for your audience. I promised myself I wasn't going to go into the political frameworks of, but I just just so you're aware of what oppositional arguments are for these types of conversations. The first thing you should probably know is that one of the things that we heard from opposition was that this is going to lead to a lot more people signing up for expungement. So there's going to be more expungements to process. And remember what we just discussed, this is a disproportionately going to hit people in Baltimore City. Disproportionately is going to affect access to education, employment, housing, and public assistance. And, one of the primary arguments was that, well, there's going to be a lot more people who need to get their records expunged. To me, that isn't necessarily a salient argument. And the other thing is, there's this belief that that once an individual has committed any form of an offense and served their time, that basically that I will say, like, parts of the state's attorney's office, for example, would like there to be this kind of like infinite stream where I can always look back, to see, even if it was 25 years ago, we may not have caught you on X, but now and so there's this I guess some would argue it's a guilty even if proven innocent, and then there's kind of like it becomes a never-ending situation. And again, if it did not affect people's ability to secure a livelihood, this would be less gratuitous. But for us, a job opportunities task force, that's the number one reason behind it. I just wanted to make sure people knew some of these arguments.
Thanks. So there was also an attempt to expand the automatic expungement bill that went into effect last year. Advocates have been trying to pass automatic expungement for about 10 years. It finally passed the legislature last year and took effect on October 1st, 2021. Essentially, cases where all of the charges were dropped and that occurred on or after October 1st, 2021, will be automatically expunged after 3 years. A person still retains the right to file an expungement as they normally would for any of these cases, which means that a person could file for expungement immediately after receiving these dispositions. If they take no action, the courts will automatically expunge after 3 years. Of course, affecting only cases that happen after the law goes into effect means we won't actually see anything get automatically expunged until October of 2024. So it remains to be seen how this will operate procedurally, to be precise. And of course, many people are just still waiting. They're still living with criminal records, and this would not affect the vast majority of people who have been living with criminal records. So there was an attempt to expand the eligibility this year that unfortunately did not pass either. It would have made the effective date go back to October 1st, 2018. So we would have started to see criminal records getting automatically expunged right away. This is something that, again, has been opposed for the reason of cost barrier, but it is something that many advocates feel is long overdue, simply because we're talking about a case where a person was not found guilty of any of the things they were accused of. And to place an additional procedural burden on the defendant who may have even been found legally not guilty is somewhat of an injustice, that a person may have to go through yet another legal procedure to clear this case off their record when the court system already decided to drop the case or even find them completely innocent. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris Dews to talk about some of the non-expungement related legislation that was in Annapolis this year as it relates to other areas that affect this decriminalization of poverty effort.
Indeed. Well, first of all, thank you, Chris. We actually normally do this in reverse. So what this section and the expungement section is kind of how an individual can remain impoverished because of an interaction with the criminal justice system. The main way is, of course, criminal records. You're not now having access to finances, not having access to a job, not having access to these things. Another way that the criminal justice system will leave you impoverished is through the fines and fees that are kind of enacted just for having an interaction. Fines, of course, monetary penalties. This is everything from a traffic ticket to they just hit you with a bill you have to pay back for whatever. And then, of course, the one people are most familiar with is restitution. I break a window, I have to pay to get that window fixed. But the one that kind of eludes many people is actually the fees. These are direct fees for service, which has to do with jail booking fees, bail investigation fees. Some counties do public defender application fees, drug testing fees, fees to actually apply for a criminal record expungement, all these different things. And what's interesting about this is that that kind of debt to the system is not part of debt protection laws. So you can have your wages garnished, probation violated, and arrest are all common to collect on the debts that you don't pay. This also includes things like paying to parole and probation. I guess I'll just go ahead and move to the next slide so you can kind of get a good gist of how this looks. So there are 3 steps to how people end up getting charged, and that's pre-conviction. So before you are convicted, during sentencing, while you are incarcerated, and then post-sentencing. The most common ones, of course, district and civil charges, depending on which court that you're a part of. The one that I'm going to focus on, and we're going to talk about this probably in the next slide, is electronic monitoring. So when an individual is on pretrial, the court, specifically in Baltimore City, will allow you to go on privatized home detention. This is the ankle bracelet, this is the box. And while you are awaiting your trial, you basically are on home detention. So you're not incarcerated, but what's not said about that is just how much that costs. So it used to be $300 to $400 a month. As of July 2021, when we pushed legislation to alter it, the private home detention monitoring agencies actually upped their prices. So now everybody, for example, at ASAP Home Detention is paying $500 a month. And if they can, while they are awaiting their trial, and remember they're home, right? Because they're on home detention. And if they cannot afford to pay it, that's a violation of the conditions of their release, and they find themselves incarcerated. I'll just stick to some of the other ones that are kind of interesting. I think I'll skip to the post incarceration, parole and probation, $100 flat charge for drug testing, $1 per alcohol test, $6 per random, and then of course all these other fees. And the thing that hits me the hardest is when you don't pay these things on time or in good standing, the Central Collections Unit does have the power to charge on average 17% interest on any of these charges that you're hit with as just using parts of the system, and they can hit you with late fees as well. And of course, you can also, while you're incarcerated, be forced to pay child support. I don't want to say forced, but those payments do not stop. So when you come out, you're hit with all this excess amount of debt that you have to pay back just for having an interaction with the criminal justice system. A lot of this was part of, pushing the cost off of taxpayers and onto lower income persons. And so what you have is people that are either in contact with the system, and many times, if we're going to be blunt, abused by the system, having to fund the system in its entirety. We pushed legislation on this in 2021, trying to eliminate a lot of these fees. And the backroom conversations that we ended up having was, well, this is how the system is funded now. So because of that, we can't necessarily do things to make these changes because this is what funds the criminal justice system, is this money being taken primarily off the backs of lower income persons. I can move on to the next slide. One of the ones that I just mentioned was private home detention electronic monitoring. Like I said, it's roughly $500 a month. This was so bad that Baltimore County had privatized home detention, and they realized a 33% increase in the cost that their residents were paying. So they actually moved to make it a public a situation where now the state is covering it. We looked at that kind of conversation and we wanted to do the same thing. And we've been trying to push a bill similar to this since 2017, when we saw a massive change in the bail reform lobby. Instead of a lot of people making money through cash bail, a lot of those individuals shifted to private home detention because there was more money in that. And unlike bail, in which you get your money back when you show up to trial, when you pay that $500 a month for pretrial electronic home detention through private industry, you don't get that money back. So if I'm waiting 3 months for my trial, that's $900. I'm sorry, math. That's $1,500. And when I show up to trial, even if I'm not found guilty, that money does not get returned back to me. So we pushed a legislation in 2021 that passed, and what it simply said was that the state will cover the cost for pretrial home detention for lower income obligors. And the obligor specifically has to qualify for a public defender. So if you qualify for a public defender, then the cost is covered automatically. The Maryland judiciary, the courts actually created the payment program to be in line with the law. And it worked out beautifully. So as long as you qualify for public defender, the court managed the payments. The downside was that it was designed to sunset in June of 2022 because it was connected to one, federal funding, and two, it was supposed to be a COVID measure. But our end game is to move towards where individuals who are lower income do not have to pay for highly exploitative private home detention monitoring altogether. So we passed legislation this year. We wanted to extend it for 3 years, but we ended up extending it just to until the federal funding runs out. We've got about $4.5 million more left in privatized home detention that can be used to fund lower income persons. But we want to move towards a statewide pretrial home detention process where individuals are not having to pay out of pocket if they are lower income for electronic monitoring. So that was a good bill. It moved. We're just going to keep moving in that direction. Just wanted you to be aware of that. The next set of issues have to do with, I want to say, motor vehicle laws. So we can move on to the next slide. And I guess I'll actually give it to Chris. He can kind of explain the landscape of this.
Sure. So Maryland's job networks, Maryland's public transportation networks, and the way that this interacts creates a landscape where, in order to get to work, especially in order to get to a well-paying, sustainable job, people typically have to drive. You can see here that 46% of Marylanders drive to another county for employment, and pretty staggering statistic that only 9% of jobs in the Baltimore region can be reached within 1 hour one way through public transit. So if people want to get back on their feet, if people want to get a leg up and connect to employment that's going to allow them to pay debts owed to the state, allow them to pay debts owed to the Motor Vehicle Administration, they are going to have to drive. And of course, in order to drive legally, people are going to have a valid driver's license. So something that legal advocates have seen quite a bit of, and community advocates on these issues, of course, is the catch-22 that many people find themselves in, where if they have been without employment, they have been unable to afford fees related to traffic tickets, child support, any of the things that Chris has mentioned in the last few slides. And if their license gets suspended due to some sort of traffic violation that they weren't able to pay, then of course they're not able to get it reinstated, and they may have to take the risk of driving to a job interview, driving to childcare, driving to a new job that would allow them to pay back these things illegally, in a sense, because they have a suspended license or something of that nature.
Yeah, so those statistics. One, the 46% comes from the U.S. Census Bureau, their American Community Survey, and the 9% statistic comes from a study by the University of Minnesota back in 2020. The bottom line is, if you can't drive in this specific state, you don't really work. And there's all sorts of systemic issues. Some people will argue it's called last mile racism, where a lot of the public transportation can get you to within 1 mile of your place of employment, but it doesn't actually get you to the place of employment. Every job I've ever had to work in my entire life, I had to drive towards. Public transportation would not have gotten me there. And so if you limit access to where people can actually reach places of employment, you're going to leave people without just economic hope. And that, of course, is going to lead to people having to come up with alternative means of economic access. So we can move to the next slide, because we did work on a variety of pieces of legislation to kind of fix some of this. And just to be aware, one of the ones was to eliminate license suspensions for lower income child support obligors. What this bill simply said was that if you make less than 300% the federal poverty line, or $47,777, let's just say 40K, then your license would not be suspended if you were found unable to pay. There's this kind of myth that, well, if you stop them from, if you take away license suspensions, then people will just do whatever they want. That's not necessarily true. When it comes to child support, you still have the ability to garnish wages. And if a person is voluntarily impoverished, that is illegal by state law. What that means is that you have the means, or you can get access to employment, but you're choosing not to. That's illegal by state law. All this bill said was the tool that says take away the person's license, that's too crippling, specifically as a person who ran a training program like myself, trying to hire people and then having to turn them down because we weren't able to get their license situation together in time, which was the whole point of bringing them into the program so that they could be ready to go for employment. It's kind of backwards. So it was a very good bill. It had a lot of support in both chambers. It's just some members of the House leadership just didn't put up for a vote. It wasn't even that they were against it. They just didn't put it up for a vote. So we're going to be taking that issue again next year, because people need to pay their child support. I don't know how they're going to pay it if they don't actually have an income. So that was one issue. That's the actual driving. And then there's the cost of auto insurance. Now, depending on where you live, auto insurance providers will base a lot of what your cost is going to be based on your zip code, where you live, and your credit history. Both of those two factors are rather interesting. Put them together, an individual can be paying anywhere. Well, let me just put it like this. If you're in an African-American zip code, primarily, statistically, the Consumer Federation of America found in African-American zip codes that on average, this is nationwide, you're going to be paying 70% more just for being in a predominantly African-American zip code, all things equal, than a Caucasian zip code. It's just that simple. The Baltimore, Washington metropolitan region was found to have the worst auto insurance disparities between Black zip codes and white zip codes, Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods in the nation, with Black zip codes paying 94% more, which is wild because the statistic is also the same when it comes to credit history. If you have bad credit or no credit, you're going to be paying significantly more in auto insurance than somebody with excellent credit on average, with all factors remaining constant. Bankrate did a study that basically said that a person with excellent credit is paying roughly $1,560 for their auto insurance, but a person with poor credit is paying $2,935. And roughly, if you put those numbers together, it's about 94% more on credit history alone. So what we have in this state is we got people with DUIs who are paying less in auto insurance than those who have a clean driving record, but just have poor credit for whatever reason that might be. Combine that with the Urban Institute statistic that simply said that lower income African-American, well, just African-Americans in general, on average have a 21% of us have a credit history of 700 and over. That's 21% of African-American families, but Caucasian families have about 57% of them have higher credit. So it becomes racialized, but I don't even want to dwell too much into that. The bottom line is when you can't afford the auto insurance, people end up driving without it. And so we tried to fight to get rid of those non-driving factors. That's a huge push. The auto insurance lobby is very powerful. And to be honest, the lower income communities of color subsidize the cost for the well-off non-communities of color. So when people can't afford it, they just drive without the auto insurance. We're talking about the difference between $100 a month and $315 a month. That's the kind of statistics that we've seen when I've been working with trainees in Baltimore City. And we can move on to the next slide. The bigger issue is simply that 600,000 Marylanders drive uninsured, 600,000, primarily in Prince George's County, which has the highest uninsured rates in the nation. And then after that, I believe is Prince George's County, Baltimore City, and then Montgomery County. So if you drive uninsured, it's up to 1 year in jail, $1,000 fine or both for the first offense, which is common in Maryland state law, just to have that type of judicial punishment. The issue is that you're literally criminalizing people who primarily cannot afford it. If you make $15 an hour, that's roughly $30,000 a year. But if you're paying $300 a month in auto insurance, that's roughly 12% of your gross income, not factoring for maintenance, gas, or even the purchase of the car or any other costs that you have associated with your life, like rent, children, and everything else. So we tried to change the penalties, kind of push the incarceration back. Instead of a $1,000 fine, cut that in half to 500, push that, and then push the incarceration back to the fourth offense. We wanted to decriminalize it altogether, but of course, Maryland Department of Transportation was not going to have that. So we partnered with them, and that's the solution we came up with. But it's a mess. And so, like I said, if a person cannot drive, they cannot work in this specific state. If you're in New York, it can make it happen, but here you got a lot of these different issues. So this is, at least in a summation, how JOTF finds people criminalized simply because they don't have access to income, and how being criminalized leads to people having access to income. That's our kind of general presentation. I'll pass it back to Chris.
Yeah, thanks. And I can really just share anecdotally that my work with job trainees in my MVLS program that I operate, actually I've met a couple trainees who went through one of Job Opportunities Task Force training programs who had actually been given job offers. They were living in Baltimore City, and I can remember one individual who had received the job offer, but he had to go down to Anne Arundel County, and he actually owned a vehicle, I believe, through a program with his training site, but he wasn't able to register the vehicle or reinstate his license because of fees related to all of the things that we've been discussing. So this person ended up having to turn down the job offer and take something that paid significantly less that he could access by bus. And that is just one person who I met in my time working with JOTF trainees, and he is certainly not alone. So it's really just, it's astounding when you see how all of this stuff stacks up to prevent people from obtaining improved employment opportunities. And that about wraps up our presentation today. I thank everyone for their attention and for joining us this afternoon. I thank Chris Dews for being here, being so generous with his time and sharing his knowledge about these issues. And if anyone has any questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat box or the question and answer box. And if anyone wants to reach out to either one of us about anything you heard today, or even if you want to get involved with volunteering as an attorney or get involved with advocacy, you can reach out to either of us for those respective issues. I will hang out for another minute and see if any questions pop up. But otherwise, I thank everyone for their time. I see the question coming in that says, how often are you currently seeing objections to expungement requests? I would say not too often. In fact, in my experience over the last year or so, rejected expungements and expungements that were being objected to for questionable reasons, I think have actually decreased. We had gone through a period of judges setting expungements for hearings or rejecting them with no basis in the statute. And we were having to go to court hearings and simply to be told that, yes, the expungement is eligible, even though there was no objection from the state and the statute requires that the court grant the expungement. Anecdotally, I have seen that happening less. As far as valid objections from the state, those do happen occasionally, and there are still some gray areas in the expungement law that allow for a good faith objection from the state and a hearing on those matters.
Well, seeing that was my only question, I just wanted to say I am going to put my information in the chat if anybody wants to have it. I see that it's on the board, but I'll also leave my phone number as well. If anybody, like I said, I do public policy. So if anybody has stories or has experiences or has worked with clientele that, has either been a part of these types of circumstances or been a part of these types of situations, or you have some other issues with regards to decriminalizing poverty that they maybe failed to notice or failed to mention, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always available by phone or text message. Just let me know, man. Call me, text me, and just be like, hey, Chris, have you considered this? And you never know. This happens all the time. Just a phone call, and that could be the bill for one of our policy initiatives for 2023. We're always about new ideas and what it's going to take to get people where they need to be. Like I said, it's not even a Republican or Democrat thing, not a liberal or conservative thing, not a soft on crime or hard on crime thing. For us specifically, it's just, can this person secure employment? And if they can secure employment, then they can secure their families. If they can secure their families, they can secure pretty much a lot of the rest of the world. And so just wanted to plug that rather quickly. And thank you, Chris, once again for even having me on, man.
Thank you. Okay, we'll wrap up here. Again, thanks everyone for your participation and attention today. We're glad to be here. So everyone take care.